He read my name and froze. Not in the casual way someone pauses when they recognize an old friend, but the way a man freezes when the past walks back into his life, wearing a badge with his company's logo. I watched his face drain as he stared at the HR onboarding file. 1 second, he was smiling, making tired jokes about culture fit and fast-paced environments. The next, he was pale. His jaw tightened. His pen stopped moving. "Elena Cross," he said, reading my name out loud, like he hadn't heard it in years. "I prefer Lena," I replied, calm as ever, but I saw it in his eyes. He knew who I was, and I knew who he was too. Graham Vexley, CEO, charismatic, untouchable. A man whose name appeared in the business press with glowing adjectives and leadership awards. But to me, he was the man who destroyed my father. The man who turned Benjamin Cross into a disgrace before the world, labeled him a thief, a liar, a man who lost his integrity after years of loyalty. Except my father didn't lose anything. It was taken from him, frame by frame, signature by signature. All while Graham sat at the top of Tremont Capital, untouchable and golden. That was 10 years ago. My father died broke and blacklisted, never able to prove his innocence. I was 19 then. Now I was 28, and I was sitting across from the man who killed his name. Graham Vexley cleared his throat. "You said your name was Cross?" "Yes," I said. "Problem?" He blinked twice. No, of course not." But there was panic behind his eyes, a calculation forming. I could practically hear the gears spinning. I didn't smile. I didn't blink. I let him stew in it. They thought I came here to work. They were wrong. I came here to finish what my father started. He handed my onboarding packet back to HR without a word and left the room. That was at 9:12 a.m. By 3:47 p.m., I was fired. A woman from compliance escorted me out. She didn't explain. She just said, "Thank you for your time," and held the door open like I was a threat. And I was, because I never came to Tremont Capital for a paycheck. I came to tear it apart from the inside. They thought they could silence my father and bury the truth. But they forgot that the dead leave behind daughters. And this one? I had nothing left to lose and everything to expose. I didn't leave quietly. I left with a smirk and a flash drive. They didn't know I cloned from the onboarding server. Harmless-looking contracts mostly, but buried deep inside were access. Logs and an outdated floor plan to the executive file vault. They thought I was just another new hire, easy to scrub from the system. But the moment they fired me, they told me everything I needed to know. They still feared my father's name. I took the train to a cheap studio apartment I'd rented under an alias. It wasn't much. A mattress on the floor, cracked window, a table I found on Craigslist, but it was close enough to the firm to keep watching, and it had the one thing I needed: quiet. I pulled out my notebook and opened the last page. The one that mattered. My father's final handwritten message. Not a goodbye, not even a warning. Just 4 words. "Look in the vault." I hadn't known what he meant when I first found it tucked into the back of one of his old engineering books after the funeral. But now I did. Tremont's file vault, their offline, on-site backup archive, and he'd left something there. But I wasn't walking in without a plan. First, I needed names. I started with the people he worked with near the end. Names I remembered. From childhood, from quiet phone calls, and even quieter dinners. People who went silent the moment his scandal hit the headlines. I dug into their LinkedIns, followed old emails, scraped corporate bios. One of them was dead. Heart attack. Another had vanished overseas. But one remained, Isaac Ewan, compliance officer, retired, living 2 subway lines away from me. I showed up at his apartment without an appointment. He opened the door like a man, expecting ghosts. "I was his daughter," I said before he could speak. He didn't ask who I meant, he just stepped aside and let me in. Isaac sat in silence for almost 5 minutes before he finally spoke. I warned him. I told your father that Graham had no loyalty, that he was too polished to be clean. What happened? He sighed. Your father discovered something he wasn't supposed to. Hidden payouts, backdated transactions. He compiled it into a file, was going to take it to the board. Graham found out. And? He planted the theft on him. A fabricated wire transfer routed through a vendor called Conway Logistics. Your father never even touched that account. But the trail was laid out perfectly. HR, legal, even external audit, all of them were fed just enough data to make it stick. I felt sick, so why didn't you speak up? He looked down. I tried, but my testimony was intercepted. They forced me into early retirement 6 months later. A silence agreement came with my severance. He walked into the back of his apartment and returned with a single folder. Faded, yellowed, but intact. Your father's last compliance draft. It's incomplete, but it has names. I opened it with trembling hands. 10 pages of transactions, routing codes, cross-signed documents, and a handwritten list of initials with timestamps. My father had been tracking Project Obsidian, a shell, fund. I read the notes again and again. The vendor names didn't exist in the real world, but the payments? They were real, approved, signed off by Graham and 2 other C-level execs, and every trail ended just before the date my father was fired. Obsidian was their vault of secrets, and it still existed. I left Isaac's place with the folder under my arm and rage in my blood. That night, I broke into the backup copy of Tremont's document system from a former employee login I'd purchased on the dark web. Most of the files were locked, but 2 expense reports buried in Q4 of the year my father was fired led me to a dummy company still listed as a current vendor, Arkwell Systems. I cross-referenced Arkwell's routing data with old SEC transaction records. They weren't just stealing. They were still laundering money. The fund was alive, hidden, masked as tech investments and internal compliance incentives. They were still doing it, still using my father's name to keep the illusion intact. I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. Then I whispered aloud, to no one. They killed him to protect this, but now I had proof, and I wasn't going to run. The deeper I went, the more obvious it became. My father had been silenced not just by one man, but by an entire system of people who benefited from his downfall. Obsidian wasn't a fund. It was a firewall, a shield. Every time a transaction got close to exposure, it was rerouted, relabeled, disguised. And the names in the metadata? They weren't aliases. They were initials, signatures, real people, still at Tremont, still powerful. I wasn't chasing ghosts anymore. I was chasing men in tailored suits. I mapped the initials from my father's last draft against board members and executive directors from that time. It lined up. 3 men had approved Obsidian. Disbursements. 2 were still in the firm. 1 had just made partner. The 3rd I couldn't identify. Just initials. RV, no title, no mention. No trace in any directory. That was the name that haunted me. Because I knew Graham Vexley hadn't done this alone. He was the face. But someone else had been the architect. I needed access to something deeper than email fragments and compliance. Notes. I needed internal audit records, the kind not stored in the cloud, the kind buried in Tremont's physical archive, the vault. I dressed like I belonged, slacks, blazer, confidence. I walked into Tremont at 6:45 a.m., the time when security, shifts and badge checks were the most relaxed. I walked through the side entrance near the parking garage. No questions, no scan. I knew the layout from the floor plan I stole on day 1. The vault was 3 floors down, behind a biometric locked door accessible only to 3 executives. But There was one access point they'd overlooked, a freight delivery chute used only once a week for shredding overflow. I had 11 minutes while the system ran diagnostics. I slipped in, breath held, adrenaline spiking. The hallway smelled of steel and temperature regulation. I found the terminal, powered off, old school, the kind my father used to work on. It booted slow but clean. No tracking. Then I saw it. Obsidian ARPT Y13, EX password locked. I tried everything, keywords. From his files, my name, his birthday. Nothing worked. Then I saw the faint scratch on the side of the monitor. Even in dust, it hit me instantly. My father's mantra, his motto, a phrase he used whenever the world kicked him down. Even in dust, I typed it. The file opened. It wasn't just a financial document. It was a confession. My father had compiled everything. Every name, every invoice, every dummy account. He'd left notes for a whistleblower report, drafted statements. He never got to send. There were red flags across dozens of departments. And next to each one, an approval signature, GV, and then one final note, typed in bold, all caps, RV. Randall Vexley, private trustee, Graham's father. I felt the air leave my lungs. The man who had started it all wasn't even on Tremont's payroll. He operated behind the curtain, a family trust manager, the real owner of the offshore accounts, the person who funneled the money and used my father as a human shield. They weren't just protecting a company. They were protecting a bloodline, and I was the last person left who could break it. That night, I called Maya. She was a former junior, auditor, one of the few women fired after the scandal broke. I'd heard she vanished into consulting, but through an old colleague, I got her number. I told her who I was. She didn't hang up. She just said, "I always knew he didn't do it. Tell me where to meet." We met in a silent bookstore at closing hour. I showed her the files. She read them silently, jaw clenched, eyes glassy. "They used me," she whispered. "They made me help frame him. They said it was part of a performance audit. You didn't know." I knew enough. I didn't say anything. "Now you can." We made a plan, expose the truth, but not in court. Not yet. We'd go public, live, loud, uncontrollable. The kind of story no PR team could spin away. I was going to crash Tremont's upcoming shareholder gala, plug in my father's files, and let every investor, journalist, and executive see exactly who they'd been worshiping for a decade. I looked at Maya. "I'm going to burn it down," she nodded. "I'll bring the match." The USB felt heavier than it should have, like it remembered everything it held, like it knew it had waited too long to be heard. It sat in my pocket as I paced the room, rehearsing every second of what had to be perfect. Maya had secured the gala. Credentials. It wasn't hard for her. She used to audit the guest list before they pushed her out. Her contact inside still owed her a favor. Now he'd owe her silence. She registered me under a fake name as a minor PR vendor, someone who wouldn't attract security, someone just important enough to have a badge but invisible enough to move freely. The gala was scheduled for Friday night. Location, Tremont's. Rooftop ballroom, glass walls, champagne, billion-dollar egos. Time, 7 p.m. I'd have one window to act. Just one. Because Graham Vexley would be delivering a live keynote speech to the board, key clients, and dozens of journalists under embargo. I wasn't just going to expose him. I was going to make sure every soul in that room watched him fall, before he knew what was happening. 2 nights before the gala, I couldn't sleep. I laid in bed staring at the ceiling, the USB beside me like a loaded weapon. I kept hearing my father's voice. Not real words. Just the echoes of his presence. How steady it was. How I never understood why he smiled when he was scared. Why he told me, You'll learn more from being underestimated than from being praised. He was right. All my life, I'd watched powerful men ignore me, assume I was soft, harmless, the kind of woman who could be smiled at, dismissed, stepped around. They were wrong. I wasn't coming for revenge. I was coming for justice, and justice doesn't knock. It crashes the door. Friday arrived. Dressed simple, black tailored slacks, black blouse, no jewelry, hair pulled back. My badge read Lee Harmon, PR vendor. The tech Maya built into the USB was flawless. It would auto-execute once inserted into any projector or laptop. No clicks, no files to open, just live exposure. I arrived at the gala 30 minutes before Graham's speech. People buzzed with expensive laughter. Waiters floated past with glasses of things I couldn't pronounce. No one looked at me twice. I was a shadow, exactly where I thrived. At 7:42 p.m., the keynote began. Graham stepped onto the stage like royalty. He looked confident, silver cufflinks, a smile full of teeth. I stood at the back of the room, right behind the AV table. He said, "Tonight we celebrate a decade of excellence, a decade of transparency, and above all, a future of uncompromising integrity." I almost laughed. Instead, I stepped forward, opened the AV laptop case, and slid the USB into the side port. Click execute. The screen behind Graham flickered once. Then again. He noticed it. The crowd didn't. Yet. Then the screen turned black. A file name appeared in bright red. Obsidian, unsealed. Graham paused. Whispers started. Cameras lifted. Then the screen flashed to life. Internal memos with his signature authorizing offshore payments. Emails discrediting Benjamin Cross. A full audit trail showing money flowing through shell vendors. Voice recording. You bury this, or you're done. He'll take the fall, and that's it. I don't care if he's innocent. He's weak. We're not. Graham's voice. Undeniable. The crowd gasped. Board members stood up. Someone yelled, "Is this real?" Security looked around for a source, but it was too late. The truth was already bleeding through every wall. I stepped back into the shadows before anyone could stop me, and I watched the empire begin to burn. I didn't run. Not immediately. I stepped into the firestorm and let it burn around me. The screen was still playing when I slipped back into the side corridor, audio spilling out into the ballroom. Line after damning line. The crowd had stopped pretending. Whispers turned into shouts. Cell phones were recording. Board members stood frozen, watching their billion-dollar image go up in flames. On screen, my father's audit trail, his original voice memos, side by side. Graphs showing Tremont's success directly linked to Obsidian's cash flow, and then the final line. If this ever sees daylight, I'm finished. He'll be a scapegoat. Better that than me. Graham's voice, clear, unedited, smug. It echoed across the chandelier-lit rooftop like a confession delivered from a pulpit. I paused just inside the stairwell door and looked back through the cracks. Wasn't moving. He stood there, pale, blinking hard, like he couldn't understand how the house he built was crumbling beneath his feet. Then he saw me, our eyes locked. One breath, one heartbeat, and I mouthed the words, "You should have let him." Live. Then I was gone. Maya was waiting outside in the alley. She didn't say anything, just held out a hoodie and a new set of clothes. We changed in the back of a delivery van and drove. I didn't ask where. She didn't offer. All I knew was this. Graham. Vexley was finished. Within 2 hours, the story was everywhere. Not just in business blogs or legal newsletters. National, viral. CEO's live gala collapse exposes. Decade of fraud. Secret files reveal. CFO Benjamin Cross was innocent. Whistleblowers. Daughter destroys billion-dollar firm in broadcast leak. They didn't know my name yet. Not officially. But it wouldn't take long, and I didn't care, because I wasn't hiding anymore. The next morning, Maya and I watched the news from a cheap motel in Yonkers. The reporters said federal agents were investigating financial crimes linked to Tremont. Multiple warrants had been issued, but Graham? He was missing. Last seen leaving the gala through a private side exit. They said his personal phone was deactivated. His travel cards frozen. His apartment emptied by the time authorities arrived. He was running, just like cowards do when truth chases them. I spent the day reviewing copies of my father's files. There were names we hadn't touched yet. Other executives. Other schemes. Tremont wasn't the only company Obsidian had reached. There were at least 3 other firms tied to Graham's private trust. This was bigger than him, and I was only just starting to realize it. That night, I received a message, unmarked, untraceable. You think this ends with him? You have no idea how deep this goes. Back off. I showed it to Maya. She stared at the screen and said, "Congratulations." That's when you know it's working. At 2:14 a.m., I walked alone to the bench outside my father's old building. The place was condemned now. Empty. Ghost-like. I sat on that bench with the wind biting at my neck, clutching the USB that brought everything down, and I whispered, "I did it?" But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't over. I didn't just take down a man. I cracked a system. And the men behind it? They wouldn't go quietly. 3 days after the broadcast, Tremont Capital was unrecognizable. The logo was removed from the glass tower. Every media outlet had a different headline, but they all agreed on one thing. The firm had collapsed from within. 2 board members resigned on live television. Federal agents raided the main server farm outside Philadelphia. Obsidian was now a code name in 2 major investigations, and somewhere in the middle of it all, I was a ghost watching it unfold from the outside. But the truth? I wasn't hiding. I was watching it burn. It was strange how fast things unravel when the lie is finally bigger than the cover-up. More whistleblowers came forward. Some anonymous, some brave enough to speak on camera. One man revealed how he was told to falsify invoices. A woman shared how she was paid off after questioning a quarterly report. But the moment that stopped me cold was the evening Isaac Ewan, the retired compliance officer, appeared on a major network. He looked right into the camera and said, "Benjamin Cross didn't fail Tremont. Tremont failed him, and then they erased the man who tried to stop them." My father's face appeared on screen next to his, quote, "even in dust." I broke down. Tears I didn't know I had left spilled down my face. He was finally free. Not from death, but from the lie that tried to outlive him. Meanwhile, Graham Vexley was still gone. The FBI called him a fugitive. Interpol was alerted. Whispers suggested he was holed up in Montenegro, under a false name, protected by the last few allies. He had left, but his empire was gone. His accounts frozen, his properties seized. He had power. Now he had nothing, except his guilt and his silence. I could have disappeared too. Started over, but I didn't. Because something in me had changed. Taking him down wasn't the end. It was the beginning. I launched Crosswatch, an open-source platform designed to help employees trace corruption inside their own companies. A hybrid of anonymous submission, ethical forensics, and legal routing. It was slow at first. Then it exploded. Within weeks, I had hundreds of tips. A few were small, petty embezzlement, false billing, but others felt like déjà vu. One involved another family trust laundering money through shell firms in Arizona. Another named a CEO who once sat on Tremont's advisory board. I wasn't chasing revenge anymore. I was chasing the roots. Because once you dig deep enough, you realize corruption doesn't grow in silence. It grows in the dark. And I was going to be the light. I visited my father's grave on a warm Thursday afternoon. It had been almost a decade since I stood there with shame clouding my lungs. This time I stood tall. I placed a copy of the cleared SEC report at the base of the headstone. On top, I placed a framed news clipping. CFO Benjamin Cross, posthumously exonerated. DOJ acknowledges internal fraud cover-up, no flowers. Just truth. I whispered, "They know now," and for the first time since he died. I didn't feel small. I felt whole. A month later, I passed Tremont Tower. It had been renamed, rebranded, repainted, but I stopped anyway. I stood across the street and stared at the place where my father lost everything, and where I'd taken it all back, and I said, quietly, to the sky, "You erased him, so I erased you." Then I turned and walked into my next war.